Okay. Hello, everyone. I am Shrutirupa Banerjiee, and today I'm presenting a session on the art of understanding vulnerabilities. So let's get started. So first of all, who am I? I work under WAF Research as a web application security analyst at Qualys, Pune, India. I am a chapter lead for InfoSec Girls, Pune. I'm also one of the mentor at Cyber Preserve community, a lead in Breaking Barriers Lean In Circle that we have recently started. I'm also one of the lead for Women Who Code, and I have been a speaker and trainer at various conferences such as B-Side Singapore, OWASP, C-Sides Conf, and also I am a blogger. So I keep writing about different cybersecurity jargons, the terms. I try to write them in as simpler way as possible. So let's start. So what is the motive of this session? Like, why am I talking about the art of understanding vulnerabilities? We all know we have multiple resources over the internet about understanding what kind of vulnerability a particular application might be vulnerable to, or anything related to. If you are looking for any kind of payload for finding vulnerabilities in an application, you will find them all in Google. Why am I talking about it? What is the motive? First of all, most of the time what I have observed, or maybe in my prime time also, I was also very proud of it, like calling myself a hacker. It is completely fine calling yourself a hacker, it is completely up to you. But being a cybersecurity professional, there comes a huge responsibility, because you are right now understanding, you're in that stage where you can understand the problems that an application might be having, the vulnerabilities that an application might be having, and what the solution and organization can try for securing that particular application. So this is one thing that most of the time people lack this sense of responsibility as a security professional. Another thing is, again, as I already mentioned, you might be able to find different kind of payloads, both basic and advanced level payloads on the internet. But most of the times we don't understand the approach towards finding a vulnerability. I'll give you an example that sometimes what happens that we have been given an application, suppose a web application, and we just use any tool such as Burp Suite or Nmap or anything, whichever tool you want to use. We just run the payloads, we just scan the application. These tools are there, which are there to make our task easier, right? But that does not mean that we don't understand what is happening underneath. So this is what I'll be specifically talking about in my session today. So let's talk real. How do we identify if an application is vulnerable? What are you looking for? We all have learned about the phases of hacking, like enumeration, scanning, and then I don't even, I have not mentioned any of them over here. But these are the steps where you end up with exploitation, then post exploitation, and you just keep on doing all these things, which are not wrong, which is correct. But I'm talking about the very first thing what you should be doing when you get an application. First of all, how do you identify if an application is vulnerable? Like, today we will be talking with respect to a web application, but this is kind of similar to other applications as well. So here you can see there's a client and there is a server. What do? We find an input point, the end point. We try to send some request. So we put some input and we see how the server is responding. That's it, right? Based on that, we understand what is happening over there. So we try to send a kind of request. Basically, if there is an input field and if it is asking for a number, we try to send string or different characters or different kind of some kind of script. Maybe most of the times we do that, right? Some kind of script, we have just sent it to the server and we see how the server is responding. Is there any kind of unusual behavior? If there is, we can try to understand, analyze more. What I mean to say is, we can try to dig deeper into it to understand what is happening. Is it actually happening because of any kind of problem or flaw in the code? Or this is how the developers have written the code? So this is the difference that you will have to understand. So before that, I would like to mention few more things. Like, you have been given an application, a web application, right? And in that web application, the next thing, after, whenever you find an input point, the next thing that you see is giving different kinds of requests, right? And then you see the behavior. Again, now it depends upon some other kind of things, like what is the server, what kind of language is being used at the backend, what kind of database is being used. All these things come under the process of enumeration or information gathering that are under the phases of hacking that you must be aware of. Here I'm talking about the very basic thing, something that is slightly which goes around the enumeration part. So what do we do next? Suppose we found an input point. We have sent some kind of weird payload. Suppose I'm not talking about payload, maybe some weird kind of request. And we see the server is responding in an unusual manner. So what do we do? Analyze, of course. We do analyze. How? So there are, of course, two ways to analyze. One is manual and the other one is automation. Now, initially at the start only, I did mention about the automation part where you're using different kind of tools for automating the tasks. And using tools are not wrong. You should be using tools because you want to complete your work, you want to finish the work as faster as you can, but in a proper way. But here what I mean is the first process of finding an input field was a very manual step, right? Where you saw there's an input field, you put some kind of example over there, some kind of payload over there, and then you see the server responding. If you see the server is responding in a weird way, and if you think of a client-side vulnerability, suppose cross-site scripting, so in that case, you can use an automated tool. You can play with it a bit manually and then start an you can use an automated tool. In that tool, you will mention the kind of scripts or the payloads it should be using. Like suppose if your application is not allowing image tags or script tags, will that make any sense if your automation tool is still using image tags or script tags? No, right? You have to save the time. You have to save your precious time, your precious thought process, right? You don't need to think of certain things which are not at all required. So you will have to think smartly in this situation. You will have to understand what is happening over there. So this is how you should be thinking about automating your work. So automation is not an alternative to manual work, but to make the work easier. You always need to have some manual work. You cannot be totally dependent on the tool because it is you who have to finally analyze and look for false positives and what may or may not be missed by the application. Analyzing a bit manually is always helpful. It is always necessary as well. Because these tools are the ones which have been written by humans only, right? So what are the steps that you would be looking for? So if a server is behaving unusually, is it a vulnerability or just a flaw? What is the difference between a vulnerability and a flaw? Your vulnerability may be some kind of a very weak security flaw, which may or may not be exploitable. This is also something very important to remember. A vulnerability may or may not be exploitable. Even if it is exploitable, it is not necessary for every individual to exploit it. This is also one thing that I am focusing on in my session. Like most of the time, I have observed many people who are into cybersecurity get upset over not finding some kind of vulnerabilities which their friends or their colleagues might have found, which is completely okay. Each and every individual has their own ways of approaching towards finding a vulnerability. It is important that you learn each day. Your competition is you, not with others. That is very important right now. Now you understood, right? What is a vulnerability? What am I talking when I say vulnerability? Then what does a flaw mean? Flaw means maybe there is some kind of logic, some kind of wrong logic used in the code. Um, this may sometimes result into business logic flaws, by the way. But flaws are mostly such like if there is some kind of mistake with the code, mistake in the code which has not been removed, or the function that is being used is a bit flawed. It is not, you know, it is not able to execute the function the way it should be. But can a flaw become a vulnerability? Yes, it can. It can always happen. I'll give you an example. Like in blockchain, we have smart contracts, Ethereum-based smart contracts, where most of the vulnerabilities which I have observed are not just vulnerabilities, but there's some kind of logic flaws. And once manipulated very well by a malicious user, has turned into a vulnerability. Sorry, and as a result, has it it got exploited. So there are examples where a flaw can become a vulnerability. And yes, you're finding vulnerabilities to exploit, right? Many a times you do exploit a vulnerability or you do not. So you may or may not exploit a particular vulnerability. That does not always mean that it cannot be exploited. So if you are into cybersecurity domain, you have been given an application and you find some kind of vulnerability, but you are not able to exploit it, that does not mean that somebody else cannot exploit it. And again, that does not make you any less of a security professional. This is also something that one should be keeping in mind. If you cannot find a bug, a vulnerability, that does not mean you are not a security professional. Just keep working. Okay. So, sorry. So, that does not always mean it cannot be exploited, right? And not every security professional can find all the vulnerabilities. These are some very important points that should be kept in mind. This is one very basic reason which is why I wanted to cover this topic. Through the art of finding vulnerabilities, there are certain things that you should be remembering. Like you cannot find all the vulnerabilities. Nothing is 100% secure. And a vulnerability may or may not be exploitable. So any of these things are not making you any less of a security professional, but you have to keep learning. Because there have been I have observed, in fact, when I was very new, I also did face some kind of such kind of things where I could see people around me who were able to find every vulnerability, though they did not find every kind of vulnerability. I'll give you another example. Like there are 0-day exploits. We keep seeing 0-day exploits every day. If so, there is a security professional or security researcher who found a 0-day in a very big application. It means that that person has actually paid that much amount of time. That person has that much amount of knowledge and has that much amount of patience to find that vulnerability. And then he may not, he may have overlooked some other kind of vulnerability which have again been found by some other security professional. So it completely differs. It is totally dependent on your approach towards finding a bug or a vulnerability or or exploiting a vulnerability. So now a very basic thing. We did talk about a flaw that can turn into vulnerability. We did talk about not all vulnerabilities are exploitable. So we are talking about what is a vulnerability assessment and penetration testing. This is one very important thing that we often do not think of. If you have been given a web application to find vulnerabilities, and if you're just finding, again, I'm giving an example of XSS. If you have just found an endpoint where writing script alert script is giving you a pop-up, that does not necessarily mean it is vulnerable to XSS. Are you able to steal the cookie? Are you able to do any kind of account takeover? Are you able to deface the entire website? Are you? If you have not tried all these cases, there are many more cases. I just gave you 3 of them. So if you have not tried, or if you see that nothing is happening out of them, it means that you have just performed vulnerability assessment, that this is something happening which is unusual. Of course, even that should not be happening. But if it is happening, and if you're not able to do, or you do not do anything further, then you have just done vulnerability assessment. A penetration tester will actually exploit the vulnerability, and depending upon the scenario, it will create the critical possibility of the situation. For example, if there is a web application, if it is vulnerable to XSS, a penetration tester's aim would be to steal the cookie, take over the account, deface the website. If penetration is tester is has been given a machine, and just he has been given a web application, suppose just a web application he has been given, then his or her aim is to completely get the root shell of the server. This is how he or she has completely done the penetration testing. So there's a difference between vulnerability assessment and penetration testing. And again, none of them are less. They are equally important. We have SOC team, we have VA team, we have PT team. We have different kinds of teams. Some are monitoring, some are under fixing the flaws or vulnerabilities found. Each of them are equally important. They together are forming the base of the security of an organization. So if you're into vulnerability assessment, don't think yourself as anything less. If you're into PT, that is completely amazing. And most of the time, if people are into penetration tester, they consider themselves as hackers, which is fine. But make sure that your approach is amazing. You're helping people around. That's it. So this is the basic difference between VA or PT. Now, whether you have to go for VA or PT is your decision. But whatever you did, whatever your approach is, if you found something unusual, report it to the organization. You may or may not be able to exploit it. Why is it coming under the art of finding vulnerabilities? Because I did talk about the sense of responsibility. You are not only finding a vulnerability to earn some money, of course, you are doing, but it is more than that. You are there to secure an organization, or you're there to secure a particular application. So there is something more than that, and there comes a sense of responsibility, which I did mention before. So if you see anything suspicious in an application, it does not matter whether you are able to exploit it or not, but you should be letting the organization know so that they can take care of that. Now, it is completely dependent on, depends on the organization whether they're working on it or not. Because as I said, And we all say that maybe today a person A could not find an exploit to that vulnerability, but there might be person B who can find it. Nothing is 100% secure, and precaution is always better than cure. When you have a slight, if you see that there is some slight problem or slight doubt, what I meant to say, in an application's behavior, then it's better to analyze further, dig deeper to see what else is there. So these are the basic things that one should always be doing, like how you should be approaching and what you could do, what is the difference between certain kind of analyzing, why manual testing is important, why automation is important. Everything has its own importance, so you cannot think any of the procedure or the task as any less or less from any of them. So let's deep dive a bit more. Since we're talking about vulnerability, so let us understand from some examples. So here you can see there are two examples, test1.com, test2.com, and test1.com ends with id equal to 1, test2.com ends with file equal to abc.php. Looking at these two examples, what are some kind of vulnerabilities that you might be thinking of and why you might be thinking of? Like with id equal to 1, most of the time we'll go with single quote, double quote, or we'll try to end it with a hash or double dash that we mostly use, thinking that it might be vulnerable to SQL injection. First thing, did you check if it is even using an a database? Maybe it is using a database. Is it SQL or no SQL, no SQL? The second thing. Third, what if it is just a small application and it is not even using a database? It is just dependent on some JSON objects. That's it. Why only SQL injection? Why did only SQL injection come into picture? Come into our mind most of the time? Because we see all around these kind of, this is get based SQL injection, it is vulnerable to get based SQL injection, and we, irrespective, we don't even see if it is vulnerable. Is it just a static page? Is there anything else at the back end? We just start SQL map. Most of the time people do that. This comes under the enumeration phase, and this also comes under the phase where we spoke about analyzing. Trying SQL map out is not at all wrong, but don't you think it is just wasting your time? It is just wasting your RAM. It is wasting so much of your precious time where you can actually think about something else. Can't it be vulnerable to IDOR? Why did I think of IDOR over here? Is there some kind of account link? Accounts are getting linked. Is ID equal to 1 is giving me some other kind of accounts, or ID equal to 2 is giving me some other kind of account? While thinking of IDOR, you do think about this, right? So if exploiting this, it is actually giving you, you can see some other applications, some other users application or users portal maybe. Coming to the second example, are we going to try SQL injection in file equal to abc.php? Many people do try, but do you think, let us analyze a bit. What could be the possibilities here? We did talk about the possibilities, right? What you can think of. You can think of excesses, maybe. You can look at the code. There's always the JavaScript being used. There's a client side, right? Is it vulnerable to excesses, cross-site scripting? Another thing is, like we did talk about SQL injection. In the second example in test2.com, maybe we can try directory traversal. But why? What is the actual difference that we are seeing most of the time? The kind of resource this particular request is asking for from the server. In the first example, id equal to 1, it is asking for something else. Maybe it is asking for maybe if it is connected, if the backend is connected to a database, maybe it is asking for some information which requires the usage of the database, which is not necessarily true, because I did give you an example of IDOR. Again, in the next example, we can see that it's clearly accessing file. So why would you even try SQL injection unless there is some scope where the file is being accessed through database? Does it even make sense? No, right? We don't usually see all these things. What we will try directory traversal, we will try LFI, local file inclusion, we can try remote file inclusion. Of course, we'll be trying because we have somewhere identified the kind of resources that the particular that the client is asking for from the server. You can see the parameter and the value. Because many times what happens that whenever we try to analyze, we don't understand. We just do it randomly. Like there are people whom I have seen, running SQL map for the second example. There's no harm. You won't get anything, right? But you're just wasting your time. So the first thing, what could be the possibilities here? We did talk about various possibilities. Why only these? There could be other possibilities also. Let us talk about some other possibilities also. Like with ID equal to 1, if you go back to the enumeration phase, did you see some kind of templates being used? If yes, we can look for template injection as well. So here we have another test case. You decide your test case based on the languages being used, based on the kind of server being used, based on the kind of clients or client-side server applications that are being used, whatever resources they are being used, what I actually mean by here. Based on that, based on those results, you are trying to analyze further. After enumerating, you scan, right? So here you are actually understanding, you're analyzing everything that is supposed to be done. Like you are looking at the minute details. Like I said, you look at what kind of resources does the client is the client asking for from the server. It will give you a lot of example. It will give you a, a very big clarity on the thought process that yes, it is not asking for any kind of information from the database, or maybe there is a template that is being used. Let me try some template based injections. And I already said that the payloads are already available. You have to just put the payload and see how the server is responding. So this is how you are actually analyzing. Think what the application is asking for. Think how the server is responding to each of the requests. Another thing, identify, as we said, identify the resources that the client is requesting for from the server. So again, if I give you an example, you have to look if there's another input point, or suppose, I'm giving a very vague example over here. There's ID equal to 1. Suppose this ID 1, this one value is being used by some kind of function that is getting executed at the bash level, or at the kernel level. It is getting executed at the kernel level. So in that case, you may try executing some functions. You will have to understand. So from here, we can definitely see that this is not happening over here. But you may guess from the parameters sometimes. You must have tried, DVW, XVWA, where we have the example of ping command, and then we put semicolon and we put ls and see that the results are there. Why is it there? Because it is getting executed over there at the server. So that is how you analyze these things. So concluding, what I would like to say is nothing is 100% secure. Nothing. If you see that your application, your organization is completely secure, no. There are different practices that an organization is trying to implement. And why is it trying to implement? Because it knows that nothing is 100% secure. It cannot do anything about it. You really cannot. Because if you're connected to the internet, then there are huge chances that anything may happen. Maybe you are completely secure and you ended up clicking on any phishing link, which you should not be. Again, awareness about all these things are already there. Security is not a one-day work. It takes time. You learn with experience. This is one very important thing, which I have observed a lot around me, that sometimes people try to find all the vulnerabilities or try to learn everything in one day. They would, even this has happened with me also in the beginning, when I was very much new to this domain. I would see people finding vulnerabilities, and I could not even understand that why are they finding, how are they finding, what is the basic thing that is making them feel that this is the point where you should be looking for, finding this particular vulnerability. It takes time. You learn with experience. Today you learned something. Today you learned about how to find an endpoint in an application. So the next step would be analyzing that endpoint. The third step would be maybe putting some kind of malicious payloads or some unusual request, some unusual input. The next step would be analyzing how the server is responding to the same. Is it actually making any sense? Is the server really responding in a very weird way? Can we do anything about it? What else to be looked for? Right? There are people around you. You can ask. There are different communities where you can ask. Again, not every individual can find all kinds of vulnerabilities. This is also something that I already mentioned in the beginning, that you cannot find all kinds of vulnerabilities in an application. Suppose there is an application which have been assigned to find vulnerabilities to three or four people in a team. All of you are having different kind of approach, different kind of thought process. Today what I talked about is one approach. It is mostly about responsibility and what could be done, what you can think of, how you can think of. That does not mean there cannot be other approaches as well. So every individual might be having different approaches towards finding a vulnerability, different ways of looking at an unusual behavior of the server. So as a result, there will be different kind of results from you as well. A person might have find a vulnerability, other person might have found some other vulnerability and exploited. Somebody just exploited, didn't even know that the person has already exploited. All these things happen. Not every individual can actually find all kinds of vulnerabilities. So it is important that you all work as a team, you understand what is happening, learn from each other, see and understand each other's approach, and then learn. Again, keep learning. Goals are always unending. Today, if you have achieved one goal of suppose, which is I'll be talking with respect to a certification. Say if you wanted to do this ABC certification and you just completed it and you did it amazingly, in a very amazing way. You did work hard and you paid whichever amount was required and you completed the certification at one go. You will always ask for more. You're not going to stop there, and you should never. There is nothing, a person who is into cybersecurity domain with different technologies coming into picture and different kind of new vulnerabilities. Sometimes, I mean, new zero-day exploits, some weird kind of vulnerabilities are always coming into picture. They're just out of the box. You can never stop learning these things. Your goals will keep on, uh, you will always end up creating a new goal after gaining the previous one. Another thing, the last but the most important thing, be responsible. If you are a security professional, it is there should be a sense of responsibility. If you're a bug bounty hunter, you're still a security professional, a security researcher. If you're a security analyst, you still come under this category. If you're a SOC analyst, if you are just into vulnerability assessment, if you're a penetration tester, if you're just a researcher, all of you, and there are many more, of course, all of you are equally responsible for helping an organization to secure itself. Knowing the fact that an organization, uh, knowing the fact that security, and I'm sorry, knowing the fact that nothing is 100% secure. So be responsible. Everyone's role is important, and it is important to understand. It is important to see if you're finding a vulnerability, your approach should make some sense. If you found a vulnerability, you have to be responsible enough to let the organization know. And of course, if you have found a very amazing vulnerability, you should be paid accordingly because you did have paid so much attention, you did have learned so much, you did put so much of efforts. But the underlying thing is that you should be responsible. You'll be getting everything. You're learning and then you're earning. So you can contact me at LinkedIn, Shrutirupa-Banerjiee, and on Twitter, freak_crypt. And this is my blog where you can actually know about different. I keep writing about blogs on technical stuffs, mostly focusing on some corporate jargons related to cybersecurity. So let me know if you have any questions. And thank you, Techno Day, for giving me this amazing opportunity to present a session especially on Women's Day, and happy Women's Day to everyone. Thank you.